and I think now a new chapter starts. And yeah, as I said, it was a bad crash, but that Arab built a really very good, stable chassis, and I'm still here walking. Everything is good, and I'll be back racing and chasing my dream. And to be honest, I don't really. For me, this happened, and I survived. I survived very good, also thanks to the hospital. And now I'm going to continue and work back again to where I ended. Actually, I'm very thankful for actually. Yeah, being here and having, I think, a quite good recovery already until now. I think I'm quite good in walking already. And yeah, I will have to work the next month, but I'll for sure come back here.
The government's being urged to bring in more efficient measures to protect against concussion in sport. It comes after an all-party group found that schools, universities and even some healthcare professionals lack understanding about how to deal with head injuries. Well, two of the parliamentary members looking into acquired brain injuries underwent MRI scans to highlight how they feel that protocols in some sports are ineffective and that many players continue to play despite suffering concussions, such as Liverpool goalkeeper Loris Karius in last year's Champions League final. Well, the government says it takes the issue of player safety incredibly seriously. But one expert believes that more needs to be done to prevent athletes suffering long-term problems.
We only have one brain, and the brain does not recover that well if it gets repeated, if it gets injured repeatedly, or if it doesn't get time to recover properly. So these are perhaps avoidable long-term issues. So that's why I think it's important to recognise that concussion needs to be addressed medically in a certain way and needs to be treated with respect.
Let's have a quick whiz through some of the other headlines this evening. This weekend saw the final of the Women's World T20 in the Caribbean, Australia beating England. They could face each other at the 2022 Commonwealth Games in Birmingham. The ICC has submitted a bid for a women's competition to be included in the programme. The last time cricket featured at the Commonwealths was a men's 50-over competition back in 1998. Pakistan look like they're going to level their test series after bowling New Zealand out for just 90 in Dubai. Yasir Shah took 8 wickets and then 2 more in the Black Caps' second innings as they were forced to follow on. They still trail by 197 runs. And British-born Alexander Albon is going to race in Formula 1 for Toro Rosso next year. The 22-year-old came third in this year's Formula 2 championship. He's going to be the first F1 driver from Thailand in the modern era. The UK Snooker Championship starts tomorrow in York. Judd Trump has told BBC Sport that he's been hurt by some of the criticism that he's received during his career, and particularly the suggestion that he doesn't always try hard enough. He says the comments often made about him and Ronnie O'Sullivan simply aren't fair.
When you look at me and Ronnie, if we're losing, it's because we're not trying or we don't want to be there and stuff like that, compared to maybe John Higgins, Mark Selby. They're always the same, taking their time over the shots, and they always look like they're trying their best. But I think me, Ronnie, Jack, Wazowski, we're all trying our best to the same every game. We're trying our heart out, and yeah, I know myself how much work I've put in each tournament. So obviously it does hurt sometimes when people say you're not trying.
Well, it gets underway tomorrow in York. UK Championship. Regular updates here on BBC News, BBC 5 Live and the BBC Sport website, of course. The main BBC TV coverage begins on Saturday with Hazel Irvine and Jason Mohammed looking after things there. Now, on Saturday, we should have seen the conclusion of the Copa Libertadores final between Buenos Aires rivals Boca Juniors and River Plate, but Boca players were injured when their team bus was attacked by hooligans on the way to the stadium. The match was rescheduled for yesterday, but then postponed again. A new date for the second leg should be agreed tomorrow. Patrick Geary reports.
The football match that mattered too much. River Plate's fans attacked the team bus of city rivals Boca Juniors as it made its way to the second leg of the Copa Libertadores final. Windows were broken, some Boca players were injured. As parts of Buenos Aires turned to chaos, the match, billed as the biggest club game Argentina has ever seen, was postponed and then cancelled a day later. Boca said some of their squad were mentally and physically affected by what had happened.
Y creo que I think the best thing for Boca was not to play because we were not arriving in the same condition as River. Unfortunately, we had to live with this fact, and the 24 hours we've lived since have nothing to do with a party or a Copa Libertadores final. In terms of sports, we were clearly at a disadvantage and could not play.
This was the first time both Buenos Aires teams had met in the final of South America's biggest club tournament. A match known as the Super Clásico had been hyped up still further. Look at the crowd for a training session last week at Boca Stadium. The rivalry between these sides was forged in downtown Buenos Aires and is bound up in class, identity and history. Such was the risk of violence that no away fans were allowed at either leg, but that wasn't enough to stop the trouble. And there may be more at play here than simply overflowing passion. There could be a tie into organised crime and illegal ticket selling.
During the week, there was a police operation cracking down on some of these black market activities, and one interpretation is that the attack on the Boca coach was a kind of reprisal from these organised groups of thugs to the fact that their money-making schemes were being hindered.
In footballing terms, this second leg was perfectly poised after a raucous, rambunctious 2-2 draw in the first leg. It promised to be some game, but the appeal and problem of this fixture is that it's much more than a game. Patrick Geary, BBC News.
Our reporter Manny Jasmi is in the Argentine capital, and he told us how this whole incident has damaged the reputation of the game in the country.
Well, it's in the mud. I spoke to the president of River Plate, Rodolfo Donofrio, last week, and he was saying this is such an honour for us to host such an important game. The eyes of the world are on us. The FIFA president will be here. The UEFA president will be here. All the leading dignitaries and everyone around the world is watching this game. It's a chance for us to show people, you know, what Argentinian football is really about. And unfortunately, what they've shown them is a confirmation of the sort of lazy stereotype of Argentinian football being one of dominated by hooliganism. And don't forget that Argentina are thinking about bidding as co-hosts for the 2030 World Cup. That's a long way off, but this incident, this weekend, will stay in everyone's memories for years to come.
Manny Jasmi there in Buenos Aires. Now, Maradona won the league with Boca Juniors many moons ago, and the Argentinian World Cup winner is currently managing in the Mexican second division with Dorados. Now, I remember saying a couple of months ago that this appointment would surely end in tears. Not yet, it hasn't. Here he is, after their latest win. They were flirting with relegation when he took over in September, but they've reached the playoff final. 2 matches over the next 6 days they've got, with a place in the top division at stake. Can you imagine if they get promotion? What's he going to do then? There's one match in the Premier League this evening, Burnley at home to Newcastle. A big one that, because they're just both a point above the relegation zone. Commentary on Radio 5 Live, coverage on the BBC Sport website. Quick recap of our top story, that is that England's cricketers, they won that test series in Sri Lanka 3-0, the first time they've done that in Sri Lanka. A fantastic achievement. That's all from Sports Day. We'll have an update on that Premier League match throughout the rest of the evening on BBC News, but from me and everybody else at the BBC Sports Centre, bye-bye.
You're watching BBC News. I'm Martine Croxall. The Prime Minister has been presenting her case for backing the Brexit plans that were signed off in Brussels over the weekend. Mrs May faced relentless criticism from all sides of the House of Commons as she urged MPs to think carefully about the parliamentary vote on December the 11th. There's no shortage of Conservative MPs who are already committed to voting against the deal. Labour also rejected the Prime Minister's argument that the choice was between this deal or no deal. Mrs May warned that rejecting the agreement would provoke even more division and uncertainty throughout the United Kingdom. Let's get a flavour of the debate, starting with the Prime Minister.
I can say to the House with absolute certainty that there is not a better deal available. And my fellow leaders were very clear on that themselves yesterday. Our duty as a Parliament over these coming weeks is to examine this deal in detail, to debate it respectfully, to listen to our constituents and decide what is in our national interest. There is a choice which this House will have to make. We can back this deal, deliver on the vote of the referendum, and move on to building a brighter future of opportunity and prosperity for all our people. Or this House can choose to reject this deal and go back to square one. Because no one knows what would happen if this deal doesn't pass. It would open the door to more division and more uncertainty, with all the risks that will entail.
Well, for Labour, Jeremy Corbyn said it amounted to a botched deal, and he urged Mrs May to begin working on a plan B.
This deal does not have the support of either side of this House or the country as a whole. Mr. Speaker, ploughing on is not stoic. It's an act of national self-harm. Instead of threatening this House with a no-deal scenario or a no-Brexit scenario, the Prime Minister now needs to prepare a Plan B, something her predecessors failed to do.
Well, many Tory backbenchers stood up to criticise the deal. Let's hear from a few of them.
It's very hard to see how this deal can provide certainty to business or to anyone else when you have half the Cabinet going around reassuring business that the UK is effectively going to remain in the customs union and in the single market, and the Prime Minister herself continuing to say that we are going to take back control of our laws, vary our tariffs, and do, as she said just now, real free trade deals. They can't both be right. Which is it?
The Prime Minister said that we had a legal obligation to pay £39 billion. I wondered if she's forgetting the report of the House of Lords from March 2017 that said in the event of leaving without a deal we owed no money at all. Therefore, what are we buying with £39 billion of taxpayers' money?
The Prime Minister and the whole House knows the mathematics. This will never get through. And even if it did, which it won't, the DUP on who we rely for a majority has said they would then review the confidence and supply agreement. So it's as dead as a dodo. Prime Minister, I plead with you. The House of Commons has never, ever surrendered to anybody, and it won't start now.
I listened very carefully to what my right honourable friend said, and she said that the UK doesn't want it, that the EU doesn't want it, and we heard the other day that Ireland said that no matter what any agreement, they would never have any hard border. So it makes you wonder, why is it in the withdrawal agreement at all? But the point I want to make to my honourable friend, and the question really is this. If the government, going down the road toward a negotiation, is heading towards that point when the backstop will become invoked, does that not really generally mean that Mr. Macron is right, that we will come under intolerable pressure to agree almost anything to avoid our entry into what my right honourable friend rightly says is something we never want to be in?
Yeah. Ian Duncan-Smith, just some of the reaction to the Prime Minister's statement. We'll have more on that throughout the evening. Also coming up, on another planet entirely, it's travelled more than 300 million miles on a 6-month voyage through deep space. NASA's spacecraft is set to land on Mars around 8 o'clock this evening, and we'll be bringing you the tense landing live, plus reaction from the people who made it happen. Now let's take a look at the weather forecast with Ben.
Good evening. The quiet, chilly weather of the last few days is about to get blown away. A big change in weather type, some heavy rain, some gales to come. But with that, things will turn quite a lot milder. Now, it's all because low pressure is going to start to dominate. We've got a couple of swirls of cloud on our satellite picture, low pressure systems in the Atlantic gathering strength, and these will be heading our way over the next couple of days. But before they arrive, one last quiet night to come tonight. A few showers in eastern areas. Where we keep clear skies for any length of time, there could be a touch of frost, and particularly for East Wales, the West Midlands into the West Country, the potential for some fairly dense fog patches. But behind me, you can see the change. This is our first band of rain moving in across the southwest of England, Wales and Northern Ireland as we go through tomorrow morning. The wind's strengthening as well. We could see wind gusts of 50 miles per hour or even a touch more in exposed coastal areas in the west. For the southeast of England, though, East Anglia up into Lincolnshire, here we'll hold on to dry and relatively bright weather for a good part of the day. It will still be quite chilly here, but notice temperatures starting to come up in the west. It'll turn wet across the Midlands, across northwest England, Northern Ireland and southwest Scotland, and over the tops of the Pennines and the Scottish mountains, say up above 500 metres, you may well see some sleet and some snow mixing in. Now, as we go through Tuesday night, that first band of rain clears through, but look at this area of low pressure deepening. Lots of white lines, lots of isobars here on the chart. Wednesday is going to be a very windy day. Gales quite widely, could see wind gusts of 60 to 70 miles per hour in places, and these bands of rain sweeping northeastwards. Looks like parts of eastern Scotland could see the heaviest of rain. But with wind gusts like this, there certainly is the potential for some travel disruption, perhaps even a little bit of damage. But look at the temperatures, significantly higher than they have been, up to 13, 14, 15 degrees, although with the strong winds and the rain, it won't feel that great. And then as we get into Thursday, this little area of low pressure developing here could bring another bout of very strong winds, particularly down towards the south and the west. Some heavy rain as well. It stays unsettled as we head towards the weekend, but perhaps by this stage, not quite as windy.
Beyond 100 Days is up next. Then at 8, join us for all the latest national and international stories of the day.
You're watching Beyond 100 Days. The British Prime Minister admits she is not entirely happy with the Brexit plan to avoid a hard border in Ireland.
The opposition leader, Jeremy Corbyn, tells her the decision to plough on with her deal is an act of national self-harm. But plough on she will. Theresa May says she'll take her deal to the country, insisting it is the best and only deal on offer.
We can back this deal, deliver on the vote of the referendum, and move on to building a brighter future of opportunity and prosperity for all our people. Or this House can choose to reject this deal and go back to square one.
The United States describes Russia's seizure of 3 Ukrainian Navy ships as an outrageous violation of sovereign territory. In Brussels, NATO says Russia's military action confirms a pattern of behaviour.
Also on the programme, tension on the border as Mexico moves to deport hundreds of migrants and US forces use tear gas against people trying to breach the frontier.
And I'm live at NASA's Mission Control in Pasadena, and there's just an hour to go before we find out if their InSight mission has made it safely onto the surface of Mars.
Hello, I'm Catty Kay in Washington. Christian Fraser is in Westminster in London. The Prime Minister says she's still confident that the UK Parliament will approve her Brexit deal. Listening to the Commons today, her self-assurance sounds a little lonely. There was almost no support for the deal that's just been approved by the European Union.
The vote on the deal, we were told tonight, will be on Tuesday, December the 11th. But right now, the numbers don't look very promising for the Prime Minister. Altogether, she has 326 MPs, 316 Conservatives and 10 Democratic Unionists who vote with her on a confidence and supply arrangement. The problem is the DUP won't back the government on this, and on the latest count it is said 85 Tory rebels will also oppose it. And that means that even with a bit of backing from Labour rebels, and we think it's around 15 at the most, she falls well short of the 320 majority needed to get the deal over the line.
I can say to the House with absolute certainty that there is not a better deal available. And my fellow leaders My fellow leaders were very clear on that themselves yesterday. Our duty as a Parliament over these coming weeks is to examine this deal in detail, to debate it respectfully, to listen to our constituents and decide what is in our national interest.
This deal does not have the support of either side of this House or the country as a whole. Mr. Speaker, ploughing on is not stoic. It's an act of national self-harm. Instead of threatening this House with a no-deal scenario or a no-Brexit scenario, the Prime Minister now needs to prepare a Plan B.
Jeremy Corbyn about an hour ago. Rob Watson is with me. Goodness me, this was a mauling. If I'd been a referee, I'd have stepped in to stop the fight.
You would have done, you'd have said, right, she's down on the canvas. Although actually she was remarkably robust. I mean, she always is. Her sort of tenacity, her doggedness is extraordinary. But here's what I picked out from the session. I mean, I thought in a way it was almost surreal because she was attacked, not just a little bit in niggly points, but attacked in a major way by Remainers, Leavers alike, and even those who were supportive are supportive by saying, well, you know, it's the best of a bad job, Brexit, really. And that made me think, if you sort of step back, you know, if British politics was an individual, you'd say, goodness, they need therapy. I mean, this looked like they were in a bad place, to sort of pall of kind of gloom and dismay about the turn that British politics has taken.
But she's going to plug on. She's going to talk about the practicalities of the deal, what we leave, what people voted for, rather than the legal nitty-gritty. She's asking for a televised debate with Jeremy Corbyn. It's starting to feel a little bit like a mini general election campaign. The only problem,
no vote.
Well, but the problem I see with that is that last time it didn't go very well.
No, absolutely. While the Prime Minister is amazingly kind of dogged, and an awful lot of people feel sorry for her, they tend to feel sorry for her until she opens her mouth. I mean, she's not one of the great campaigners. But here's the thing. I mean, I know it looks grim and she's not a great salesperson, but someone put this theory to me, and it's an interesting one. I'll run it past you and everybody else watching us, that maybe she wins in the end. I mean, I know it looks kind of crazy and unlikely, just because, you know, the Leavers aren't united around a particular person or a plan, and neither are the hardcore Remainers.
No, that is
in other
true.
words, she might sort of win by default, as it were.
Yeah, it is true, Katia. There's no real absolute plan to decide at the moment.
No, but what there is from business a desire for some kind of certainty. I'm counting the months now. What have we got, Rob? 4 months to go. Is this really an option to go back and say to the European Union, right, let's start negotiating all over again, when it's taken us this long to get even this far?
I think the short answer to that, Catty, is no. I mean, the alternative scenarios that get talked about here at Westminster, and no doubt you've heard them on 100 Days, are one, Theresa May just says, right, you I'll let you stew over this at Christmas, New Year, you come back and have a second vote. I mean, the other alternative is you have a completely different approach to leaving the European Union, perhaps something like Norway's relationship, which is much, much closer. I mean, the other scenarios are a sort of a leadership challenge, a general election, a second referendum. I mean, the way I put it, Katia, if you think that we are in, you know, the sort of far distant waters of British politics right now, I mean, if there's a no vote, I think we go into the sort of the uncharted area, sort of right off the end of the navigational map.
Yeah, OK. Rob Watson, thank you very much for the moment. I can tell you they were speaking with one voice yesterday in Brussels, though, Catty. Everyone on the same message. It is this deal or no deal at all. And there's no appetite in Brussels whatsoever to reopen the withdrawal agreement.
Right, but you've always said, Christian, that you think that at the last minute the European Union may be able to come up with something. There may be even a second vote. I mean, it seems that the hardcore Brexiteers at the moment are kind of playing a game of chicken with the European Union, saying, we actually don't believe you. If we opt for no deal and to crash out, we think you will come up with something else. How are we to know that? That seems like quite a gamble.
Yeah, look, the Conservative Brexiteers are saying, look, if we vote this down, it might actually help the Prime Minister because she'll be able to go back and say, look, this isn't going to fly. And there is always a plan B when it comes to Brussels. Yesterday, dare I say it, they were all on the same message because that helped Theresa May. I'm not suggesting that they might have formulated the same plan, but it certainly looked like it from where we were standing. I think the problem is that if they were to put anything to it, then they will put it in the political declaration. And I've said time and again, that's the non-legally binding bit. It's like a love letter to the UK government about the aspirations they have. Unless they change the withdrawal agreement, the legal text, then it doesn't really add up to much.
OK, we will have more, of course, on Brexit later on in the programme, so stay with us for that. From Wednesday, Ukraine will be under martial law. President Poroshenko announced the measure after Russian ships fired at and seized Ukrainian vessels in the Black Sea.
And today, both the UN Security Council and NATO ambassadors met to discuss the situation. It's not clear, though, that they'll come up with a more united position on what to do about it than they already have. Russia is already heavily sanctioned, and there's little appetite in the White House to punish Moscow further. Let's listen to a little of what was said at the UN Security Council.
We strongly support Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, extending to its territorial waters. We express our deep concern over the incident, which represent a dangerous escalation and violation of international law.
If this tribunal continues to be used to turn a blind eye to the military aggression of Ukraine against Russia, and Russia wants to protect its borders, then the prestige and authority of the Council will be undermined.
OK, the BBC's Neda Tawfiq is at the United Nations in New York for us. Now, Neda, to what extent does Nikki Haley speak for Donald Trump, and to what extent is there a desire on the American side to get tougher, to impose more sanctions on Russia over the Ukraine situation?
Well, Katty, it was really interesting because Nikki Haley, at the outset of her address to the Security Council, said that she had spoken directly with President Trump and Secretary Pompeo, and that she was expressing the highest concerns of the highest form of government. And so she was really putting a rubber stamp on that, saying what I'm about to say has been endorsed by the president himself. But she really didn't go as far as what the Ukrainian ambassador himself called for. He wanted a new set of sanctions by the international community because he said that would be necessary to stop further instability in the region. Now, what Nikki Haley said in her address was that the United States would maintain sanctions over Crimea, specifically the ones over Crimea, but she said that any further reckless action by Russia would make things worse. But she didn't exactly go into detail about what those consequences would be.
Neda, the Europeans will be watching this very closely because they were nervous at the outset of the Trump administration that they might go soft on Ukraine, and no one's entirely sure what Donald Trump's foreign policy is towards Russia, or for that matter towards Ukraine.
Yeah, well, I think it was interesting, Christian, watching the unity on the Council of Western nations. Russia was clearly isolated. In fact, when they wanted to hold a discussion about how their borders had been violated, how Ukraine had entered into their waters, only 3 other countries on the Council supported Russia, and that effort failed. So it did really seem like the United States and European powers were on the same page when it came to standing by Ukraine and tough talk. But as you say, the United States doesn't really have much more appetite for sanctions. So it really just remains to be seen how the Europeans and the United States can work together to put a check on Russia. You know, really the entire Council is concerned that what happened on Sunday will really lead to a wider conflict. And though the Security Council has met dozens of times on this issue, there hasn't been any progress. OK,
Neda, good to see you. Thank you for the view in New York. Let's cross live to Kiev and speak to our correspondent there, Jonah Fisher. Jonah, martial law in place tonight in Ukraine. What does that mean for the upcoming presidential elections?
Well, discussions are still continuing this evening in the Rada, Ukraine's parliament. There's just a short distance from where I'm talking to you now. They are debating this introduction of martial law. It's expected to be a formality that they will rubber stamp it. It will be a 30-day period, and the reason that it will be just 30 days is because Ukraine has a presidential election due in March next year, and they need to effectively have an election campaign period. So it's a 30-day martial law, and Ukraine's president came out with a pretty stark statement saying this decision had been taken because they believed that this incident, these clashes in the Black Sea on Sunday, that they weren't some sort of accident, that they were deliberate. And further to that, that they had intelligence that suggested that Russia was preparing for a land invasion. Mr. Poroshenko said he had a dossier of papers telling him all about the troops and the equipment that was ready just a short distance from Ukraine's borders, and that was why he had taken the decision to introduce martial law, and that's why it's being discussed now in Parliament.
The reaction from Russia is always the same. It was the same in Georgia, it was the same with Crimea, Jonah, and that is, we didn't start this. But the simple fact of the matter is that there is a 2003 treaty in place which gives freedom of navigation in this sea.
That's right. There's an agreement in place that basically treats the Azov Sea and the Kerch Strait, which is the only way in and out of the Azov Sea, as jointly owned waters, if you like, of Russia and Ukraine. So both of them can move around, in theory, as if it was their own water. That has not been the case for the last 6 months or so, because now that Russia has occupied Crimea, it's built a bridge to connect Crimea to the Russian mainland, and it has started taking a pretty keen interest in who uses that strait, who passes under the bridge, and Ukrainian boats and boats destined for Ukrainian ports have been subject to a lot more inspections. So that treaty certainly doesn't seem to be respected. There is still argument continuing about what happened on Sunday. Ukraine saying that their ships were perfectly entitled to be where they were. The Russian line on that is that the Ukrainian ships were in Russian territorial waters. So that debate is still continuing.
OK, Jonah Fisher in Kiev there for us. Thanks very much. For more on these escalating tensions, we're joined now by Kimberly Martin, who chairs the Department of Political Science at Barnard University and specialises in US-Russian relations. Kimberly, thanks very much for joining us. We've just got news coming in from the FSB, from Moscow. The security services saying that the Ukrainian ships ignored warning shots. The Russians, of course, today saying that this is all hysteria on the part of Russia. What does it look like from your point of view?
Well, there is an agreement, as your correspondent mentioned, from 2003 that recognizes that each state that shares this border area has the right to have its ships transit into the Black Sea. And I think there's just no question from the perspective of international law that Russia was violating this agreement and was actually looking for a fight with Ukraine. It was Russia who provoked the violence for reasons that are unclear.
Why would Moscow be looking for a fight with Ukraine at this stage? Is it something that the Russian population would support? A war? I mean, if Poroshenko is right, President Poroshenko is right, and he has plans showing that the Russians are planning some kind of a land invasion in eastern Ukraine, do the Russians really want, the Russian population really want a war with Ukraine at the moment?
I can't imagine that they would. There is a lot of cultural interchange and even family interchange between Russians and Ukrainians. Up until this point, Putin has been very careful to say that Russia has not been involved in the war in eastern Ukraine. The one possibility is that Putin's popularity has plunged recently. And so it is possible that Putin sees this as a way to rally support around his government by referring to Ukraine as the aggressor. But I think the evidence indicates that the Russian population is not as fond of Putin as they used to be because they don't see their own lives improving. And I really can't imagine that anyone in Russia would like to have a full-scale war with Ukraine. So it's especially odd because the U.S. Congress is in a lame duck session, and that means that Putin off more sanctions from the United States for a while, and it almost seems like he's trying to provoke more U.S. and Western sanctions.
Kimberly, it's a reminder, if we needed one, that this is still very much a hot war, and perhaps one of the most dangerous wars that we face in the world at the moment. The focus has somewhat drifted off to Syria and to Iraq and to Afghanistan, and because Donald Trump's not kept the pressure up when it comes to Ukraine, perhaps President Putin thinks he can take advantage.
Well, we have to remember that there are U.S. military trainers in Ukraine who are helping train the Ukrainian forces. There are U.S. lethal weapons in Ukraine. Similar weapons and trainers have come from Canada as well. And today we just had the NATO Secretary General state that he is on the side of Ukraine, that NATO stands behind Ukraine in what he termed a violation of Ukrainian sovereignty and international law. And so, regardless of what President Trump might say on his tweets, the actions that we see on the ground are pretty solidly in favor of Ukraine, and I don't think anybody wants the tensions to increase, but Russian provocations may lead to a stronger Western reaction than what Putin was bargaining for.
Okay, Kimberly Martin, thank you very much. Yes, as I was saying, Cathy, the line is always, we didn't start it, but I remember being in Crimea for 2 weeks right at the outset of the conflict, and there were these little green men walking all over the peninsula. It was pretty clear that Russia was there and Russia was going to take over. So Russian facts don't hold much water in the West at the moment. Right, let's talk about the situation on America's border with Mexico, which is pretty febrile at the moment. Thousands of migrants who've travelled north in the hope of getting into the United States are now stuck waiting on the Mexican side of the frontier. Men, women and children are camped out in a sports stadium with little services and long queues for donations of food.
Yeah, and yesterday frustration led to violence. A group of migrants led a peaceful protest calling for their asylum claims to be processed faster. But some got angry and then made a dash for the wire fences of the border. U.S. guards responded reportedly with tear gas. Mexico now says it will deport those who took part in that demonstration. With me is Peter Vincent. He's a former attorney for U.S. Immigration and Border Control. Peter, thanks very much for coming in. It is not the first time, of course, that tear gas has been used on this border. It was used back in 2014 as well. How tense is the situation on the border now, and is the response from U.S. border authorities the appropriate one to the situation?
The situation is quite tense, Cathy, and you have thousands of people who are waiting in a sort of state of limbo. Individuals in some cases that have walked with their children thousands of miles from the so-called triangle countries in the northern part of Central America, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And they are attempting to rightfully, under U.S. law and international law, apply for asylum in the United States. These are, for the most part, incredibly sympathetic people that are fleeing horrific gang violence in that Northern Triangle region, or are looking for better opportunities for their children, for educationally or financially. And the situation has been made worse by President Trump's November 8th declaration or proclamation requiring that all individuals that are applying for asylum do so at an official port of entry. That, again, is in complete contradiction to U.S. law and our international obligations, which allow individuals, however they enter the United States, either lawfully or through other than lawful means, to apply for asylum once they are in the United States.
And the reason for this is that the security situation of the people who are applying for asylum in Mexico at the moment is not good, and therefore they ought to be able to come into the United States and apply from a situation that is more safe. So what is the security situation? If you are one of these 7,000 odd people and you're camped out in this stadium, what are the risks that you face at the moment?
Cathy, it's less than ideal. These individuals are in the sovereign territory of Mexico, where they are not particularly popular. The mayor of Tijuana has made some remarks about not or being able to appropriately clothe, feed, and take care of these individuals. So there's a great deal of hostility with the Mexican nationals along the northern border of Mexico. So the tension is very acute. Again, these are individuals who ordinarily would simply make their way into the United States, either through a port of entry or through some alternative means, raise their hand and say to the Border Patrol officers present, we are simply applying for asylum, and then they would be appropriately processed in that particular manner. But now they are queued up at the border, waiting in these facilities that are not entirely accommodating, and many of them expect to wait many weeks before they're able to actually make a formal application for asylum in the United States to start the process.
It seems to me, Peter, looking from this side, from Europe, that the problems are pretty much the same on either side of the Atlantic. You there have got genuine asylum seekers and refugees that need help mixed up with a lot of economic migrants that the government wants to keep out. And one of the ways that the European governments have looked to tackle that here is to set up these disembarkation platforms outside the borders of Europe where genuine asylum seekers can be processed. So is that going to be the norm, and how does that conflict with international law?
Christian, you make an excellent point. There are some similarities here. The various organizations in the United States have challenged President Trump's declaration, and a federal district court judge in San Francisco has found that Trump's proclamation is in violation of law. The U.S. has a similar system to the one that you're discussing, but it's called refugee processing, which is done overseas, away from the United States, and there is a process for doing that as well. those individuals are usually located, in some cases, literally for generations, in refugee camps in different parts of the world, Southeast Asia, North Africa, etc. I think there will be negotiations between the Northern Triangle countries, Mexico and the United States, to figure out some safe alternative method of processing their valid legal claims, while at the same time essentially weeding out individuals who are, unfortunately for them, but not eligible for either refugee status or asylum status, because they are, as you point out, Christian, economic refugees and not facing persecution or torture.
Okay. Peter Vincent, thank you very much for joining me here in Washington. Clearly the issue, Christian, it looks like, is you've got to deal with the situation in those triangle countries of Central America. Otherwise the migrants will just keep on coming.
Yeah, it's a difficult problem here as well, overwhelming the systems in Europe as well. Now, if you thought the US midterms were over, you better think again, because there's still one last seat that needs to be filled in the Senate. It is in Mississippi, and it'll be decided on Tuesday in a special runoff election.
Yeah, Donald Trump's on his way to the state right now to lend his support to the Republican candidate, Cindy Hyde-Smith. She's leading the polls against Mike Espy, who wants to be Mississippi's first Democratic senator since 1989, and the first black senator from there for more than a century. Let's talk to Chris Buckler, who's in Tupelo for us right now. Mississippi, one of the most conservative states in the Union, if not the most conservative state. Why does a Democrat even look like they have a cat's whiskers of a chance?
Yeah, it's been a really odd one. Republicans feel that this should have been a very safe Senate seat for them, Cathy. But of course, comments are all important in an election campaign. And Cindy Hyde-Smith, who's the Republican candidate, has made a couple of comments which have caught people a little off guard and concerned some people. Specifically, a comment that she said to a supporter that if he was to hold a public hanging, that she'd be in the front row. Now, of course, that brought back many images and thoughts of lynching in this state and in other states across America, and as a result it has led to a lot of concern and a lot of debate, not least because her opponent, the Democrat Mike Espy, is himself an African American. So it's led to a very strange situation in the polls where it looks like the Democrats might have a chance, but of course so much of this is about who gets their vote out, and that's one of the reasons why President Trump is here today in Tupelo at the airport, about to hold a rally. And indeed, it's not just one rally he's holding in Mississippi today, it's two. It gives you a sense that he is throwing everything he can to make sure that he holds on to this Senate seat. And of course, that's very important as far as the maths goes in the Senate.
And we're almost out of time, Chris, so just a quick one. Donald Trump does have that magical sprinkle when it comes to the Senate seats. Tennessee, Florida, Indiana, he brought candidates over the line.
Yeah, and Christian, that is part of it. Let's be honest. We also know that the president loves rallies. He loves getting out there and being among his supporters. There is that question of, does he really have to convince some of these people? I mean, talking to them going in at the moment, they have made very clear that they're on Cindy Hyde-Smith's side. But it also puts him on television, on local stations in this state. It makes sure that people are aware that an election is happening. And given that there is a danger of some election fatigue, which I'm sure the pair of you feel after the midterms, I think getting the vote out is going to be very important for both sides if they have a chance of taking this Senate seat.
OK, Chris Buckler there in Tupelo, thank you very much. Does anyone have magical sprinkle? I meant to say the Midas touch. This is Beyond 100 Days from the BBC.
And coming up for viewers on the BBC News Channel and BBC World News, a climate change warning from the UK Met Office. There are more hot, dry summers coming.
And after 7 years of work and a journey of nearly 7 months, NASA's InSight spacecraft must now survive 7 minutes of terror as it descends onto Mars. We'll bring you that live. That's all still to come.
Good evening. The quiet, chilly weather of the last few days is about to get blown away. A big change in weather type, some heavy rain, some gales to come. But with that, things will turn quite a lot milder. Now, it's all because low pressure is going to start to dominate. We've got a couple of swirls of cloud on our satellite picture, low pressure systems in the Atlantic gathering strength, and these will be heading our way over the next couple of days. But before they arrive, one last quiet night to come tonight. A few showers in eastern areas. Where we keep clear skies for any length of time, there could be a touch of frost, and particularly for East Wales, the West Midlands into the West Country, the potential for some fairly dense fog patches. But behind me you can see the change. This is our first band of rain moving in across the southwest of England, Wales and Northern Ireland as we go through tomorrow morning. The wind's strengthening as well. We could see wind gusts of 50 miles per hour or even a touch more in exposed coastal areas in the west. For the southeast of England, though, East Anglia up into Lincolnshire, here we'll hold on to dry and relatively bright weather for a good part of the day. It will still be quite chilly here, but notice temperatures starting to come up in the west. It'll turn wet across the Midlands, across northwest England, Northern Ireland and southwest Scotland, and over the tops of the Pennines and the Scottish mountains, say up above 500 metres, you may well see some sleet and some snow mixing in. Now, as we go through Tuesday night, that first band of rain clears through, but look at this area of low pressure deepening. Lots of white lines, lots of isobars here on the chart. Wednesday is going to be a very windy day. Gales quite widely, could see wind gusts of 60 to 70 miles per hour in places, and these bands of rain sweeping northeastwards. Looks like parts of eastern Scotland could see the heaviest of the rain. But with wind gusts like this, there certainly is the potential for some travel disruption, perhaps even a little bit of damage. But look at the temperatures, significantly higher than they have been, up to 13, 14, 15 degrees. Although with the strong winds and the rain, it won't feel that great. And then as we get into Thursday, this little area of low pressure developing here could bring another bout of very strong winds, particularly down towards the south and the west. Some heavy rain as well. It stays unsettled as we head towards the weekend, but perhaps by this stage, not quite as windy.
والله مش هقدر ابغى الكلاس وما بقى نعرف وين نروح بحالنا.
Our World is a unique series of films on the BBC.
I want to be able to bring her home.
Offering personal insights into global events. Our World, stories that speak for themselves. Saturday and Sunday nights at 9:30 on the BBC News Channel. Follow the story, whatever you're doing, wherever you are. You can follow every moment in depth with BBC News. Get the full story at bbc.co.uk/news. Get the headlines as they happen with the breaking news alert. And keep up with events by watching the BBC News Channel in the app. Follow the story wherever you are with BBC News.
Sometimes being in the driving seat is... She stayed in school. She's a... This isn't just playing sports. This is... the simple act of standing, and you're a... You don't need superpowers to change the world. 100 Women, a season of inspiring and challenging stories across the BBC.
You're watching Beyond 100 Days.
Theresa May begins the task of trying to sell her Brexit deal to MPs, warning that rejecting it would risk more division and take the country back to square one. A presidential pardon. The British academic Matthew Hedges, is being released just days after he was jailed for life in Dubai for spying.
Also on the programme, mornings of hotter, drier summers in the UK, days after a US government report claims that climate change will cost America hundreds of billions of dollars. And after a 6-month journey, NASA's InSight Mars probe is due to touch down on the red planet any minute now. British academic Matthew Hedges, who was jailed for spying in the United Arab Emirates, will be flying back to London in a few hours after receiving a presidential pardon. He'd been sentenced last week to life in prison.
The pardon was announced just minutes after journalists were shown a video in which Mr Hedges apparently confessed to being a British spy. The UK's Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, called the pardon fantastic news and said that while the government didn't agree with the charges, it was grateful the issue had been resolved. Paul Adams reports.
Matthew Hedges' 6-month ordeal is almost over. 5 days after being handed a life sentence, he's preparing to come home.
Mr Hedges will be permitted to leave the country once all the formalities are complete.
The hoped-for announcement came this morning, but with it a sting in the tail. The authorities in the United Arab Emirates still accuse Matthew Hedges of spying.
He was part-time PhD researcher, part-time businessman, but he was 100% a full-time Secret Service operative.
Matthew Hedges knows the UAE well. He worked there for several years before starting his PhD on aspects of the country's security policy. Sensitive subjects, but, says the government here, perfectly legitimate.
We've made it very clear for a number of months now that we see no basis in these allegations. They've reflected on that. They've taken the action that they can, which means that Matthew Hedges is going to be reunited with his family.
The UAE remains convinced that Matthew Hedges was indeed a spy. He was certainly researching some sensitive areas, including the country's military capabilities and its role in the war in Yemen. But what he and most academics would regard as perfectly legitimate, the UAE clearly saw as suspect. Matthew Hedges' wife has campaigned for months to secure his release, maintaining his complete innocence throughout.
In my heart, I know what Matt is. He's a PhD researcher. His colleagues know it, and his family know it, and hundreds of academics around the world know it, and that's all that matters. I mean, the most important thing really is that now we'll have him back home safely, and he'll be able to finish his thesis.
Matthew Hedges will be on his way home in the coming hours. His family says the ordeal has taken its toll. His life and career put on hold 6 months ago, about to resume. Paul Adams, BBC News.
Well, joining us now is David Haigh, who's the former managing director of Leeds United Football Club. He was arrested in 2014 in Dubai, accused of fraud and embezzlement, and spent 22 months in prison in the country before being pardoned. Mr. Haigh, thanks very much for joining us. Do you think that justice has now been served in the UAE?
Not at all, because obviously, I mean, it's obviously very good that Matthew's coming home. But as the UAE have said in a statement recently, they refer to him as convicted spy. Now, so a pardon still means they think he's guilty. It still means that they think England, a friendly country, the UK, is spying on them. So justice most definitely hasn't been done, and all that's happened is essentially the UAE, in a way, are asking the world to pardon them for what they've done.
You were pardoned. Does that mean that the UAE then turned around and said all of the things, embezzlement, fraud, Twitter abuse, that they had accused you of, that they kept you in jail for 22 months, that they no longer believed any of that was true?
Well, I mean, there were two things that I was charged with. It was what's called breach of trust and then Twitter abuse. And on the breach of trust allegation, I was pardoned, but on the condition I didn't appeal. And, you know, having not done that, I wanted to appeal rather than take the pardon. So I didn't take the pardon. I ended up spending longer there than I needed to. On the Twitter abuse allegation, I was acquitted. You know, when I was found guilty of the breach of trust, it was 9 days later, similar to Matthew. So they find you guilty of something, then they pardon you a few days later. And on the Twitter abuse allegations, I was in jail for 5 months before being acquitted.
David, it's good that Matthew is free, obviously, but like you say, he is still convicted, and that has big implications for his life going forward. When you're filling visa applications or you go through airports, you're likely to be stopped.
Well, exactly, and it's not a light accusation. It's a 25-year sentence for espionage. You know, that's going to prevent him travelling widely. You know, it's going to have lasting implications. But the thing that's also going to have lasting implications is that he spent 6 months in solitary confinement, being mistreated, to the extent, what extent we don't know, but his wife certainly said he wasn't treated well, and you know, isn't in a good condition. Now, you know, that's something that stays with you. In my case, I spent 6 months in hospital when I was released, recovering from those things. So, you know, aside from the obvious difficulties he'll have with a charge and a conviction like that, he's also going to have, you know, health issues as well.
Just with regards to the confession that they've extracted out of him, I mean, how will that have been done? You've obviously had experience of the criminal justice system there. It obviously doesn't work like it does here in the UK.
But, I mean, it's something, you know, when I saw the sentence had been passed last week, and I read that there'd been accusations that he was forced to sign a false confession in Arabic. That's something that now, obviously, I work with Brits the last 2 years and other citizens that have this, and it happens again and again and again and again. They prefer you to confess to something even if you haven't done it, and they put pressure on you and often use violence against you to do that. Now, the video confessions are things specifically used in national security cases. Another case I'm working on is the kidnap of Princess Latifah, the daughter of the ruler. In that case, 2 of her travelling companions were again forced to do video confessions, admitting they'd done things that they didn't, on the basis of record this and we'll let you go. So it's common practice across the board there.
David, thousands of UK citizens live in Dubai, live in the UAE. Millions of dollars of business are done between the two countries. Do you think the British government is using the leverage that it does have over a country like Dubai in order to get more justice from the legal system?
Well, they certainly weren't up until the Matthew Hedges case. In my case, and the hundreds of others that we deal with, and my charity partner Rada Sterling has dealt with about 10,000 over the last 10 years. Up until Jeremy Hunt, the advice of the British Embassy was essentially don't rock the boat, quiet diplomacy, behind closed doors, don't go to the media. And so many Brits that have been detained unjustly have followed that advice and are now languishing there. So it's only a recent change in that the UK obviously felt the need to go public and to address this. So obviously there was something behind the scenes that made them do that. What? We don't know, but that relationship obviously wasn't working.
OK, David Haig, very good to talk to you. Thank you for coming on the programme. In its first major update on climate change in nearly 10 years, the UK's Met Office has warned today of significant temperature rises in the decades ahead. Projections suggest that Britain is likely to experience summers which could be more than 5 degrees hotter than current levels by 2070.
Yeah, and all of that comes off the back of a US government report that says unchecked climate change will cost America hundreds of billions of dollars and damage human health and quality of life. The warning is at odds with Mr. Trump's fossil fuels agenda. Bob Inglis is a former Republican congressman who is trying to convince his fellow Conservatives about the dangers of climate change. He joins us now from South Carolina. Congressman Bob Inglis, thanks very much for joining us. When you've raised the alarm before about climate change and the science of climate change, it hasn't done you any political favours in the Republican Party. Do you think you can have more success now with your fellow Conservatives?
Yes, it was bad timing on my part, perhaps in the midst of the global financial crisis. But the economy is better now. We've had more experiences with climate change. And there's a growing eco-right, we call it, a movement on the right to address climate change. And so those 3 things mean that it's safer now for a Republican to address climate change than it was in the darkest days of the global financial crisis.
OK, I should tell our viewers you actually lost your seat in Congress because you were advocating for action on climate change. How do you account for President Trump and some fellow Conservatives who deny the science of climate change? How do you account for their position? Is it purely about money? Is this all about the power of the energy industry and wanting to keep the US energy companies happy?